Chapter 11. The Passing of the Scar. A vessel is constructed for sailing, a shield to guard against harm, a sword designed to strike, a maiden to be kissed. Havamal. When the sun rises tomorrow, it'll probably reveal Greenland ahead of us, growled Einar. Lazing against the side with Magnus and the wrestler, he watched the witch fires that ran atop the waves through the darkness. The new bowerman stood next to Magnus, but Einar and he only spoke when absolutely necessary. Under flaring pine torches and awnings, the crew drank and told riddles on the rowing benches, killing time. "It'll make me happy to see it," Magnus replied. "As I ponder, I recollect the matches between wrestlers from both the eastern and western settlements in Greenland. And do you remember the grand feasts Eric loved to throw?" Halla smacked his lips gently and rested his hands on his stomach. "Of course. And let us not forget seal hunting and deer shooting." Magnus's eyes gleamed. "Tales of Greenland are numerous. There's no place as magnificent for ski running. By St. Michael, I'll be excited to reach there." He struck Einar a lively blow to his sullen hump of a shoulder. Unmoved, the Black One continued to stare out into the darkness, with his chin on his fists. "Ugh, yes, very likely," he grunted. "It may indeed be a smooth journey for you, but I am convinced that when we travel from Tove and arrive in our homes, some of us will run into trouble when our families discover we are no longer Odin men. My father is liable to put a knife in me." They sat digesting this truth until Halla broke the tension by saying quietly, "Speak for yourself, companion. My kin is no fool. He has always been on trading voyages among the Christians. He's already been baptized in both religions. When Thor doesn't assist him, he'll pray to the Christian god. That way he's protected regardless. Many Greenland chiefs share his views." Magnus's cheerful laughter resonated in the air. "That's like having a cloak that fits any weather. If only Eric thought the same. Is Eric the ruler of Greenland?" Aldrich interrupted. He had been focused on both of them, listening intently. The two sons of the Greenlandic chiefs simultaneously answered, "No." Magnus raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Well, even though Greenland is a republic, Vidar the Black is still in charge," Magnus continued. "He was the first one to settle, so he owns most of the land. Besides Brattahlid, he owns numerous fishing stations, as well as stations on several islands where men gather eggs and driftwood for him. Not only is Vidar the richest man, but he's also of high birth. His grandfather was a Jarl of Jaderen. So—" Aldrich was lost in thought and cut in abruptly, saying, "That's where I heard the name, Vidar the Black, in a ballad sung by a minstrel in a trader's booth in Norway. It was called Vidar the Black and his dwarf-cursed sword. Do you know about it?" The others involuntarily glanced towards the chief, Halla, who responded dismissively, "It's just vulgar gossip. There's no need to bring up a dwarf cursing Eric's sword, just to explain why he's been exiled 3 times for manslaughter and driven from Norway to Iceland, then from Iceland to Greenland. He would fight and kill whoever he would settle with, because he has a temper like that of a dragon, Fafnir." Einar flushed pale red, but Skroppa's prophecy came true. After Eric planted the sword into the Greenlandic soil, the sword didn't bring misfortune again. "Skroppa!" Aldrich exclaimed, but Magnus put his hand over his mouth. "Speak quietly when you say that name, Aldrich," Magnus warned. Einar spoke seriously. "Don't speak it at all. The English girl is coming to the aft. Maybe she's carrying a message from Hedwig." Excitement stirred among them as Edvarda's smooth brown head weaved through the crowds towards them. The Shield Maiden's beckoning was long overdue. It was unheard of for a woman to turn the forecastle into a sanctuary for herself and forbid their approach. Einar grumbled, entertaining the idea of refusing her request, but it was empty chatter. Magnus, amused by their antics, adjusted his ornaments and tousled his locks. "She may attend my invitation to play chess. Tove spoke with her for hours this afternoon. Perhaps he snapped her out of her dark mood," he suggested. "It is plausible," Aldrich said quietly, his voice laced with something peculiar, which caught their attention. As he blushed, he tried to joke, "My intuition says she summoned me." Einar, scowling, snapped back, "You!" Aldrich laughed mirthlessly. "There's no need to get riled up. I'd rather be drowned than go." Magnus was offended, indignant at Aldrich's hatred towards the woman who offered to be his friend. "Hatred! I thought better of you, Aldrich of England." "Hatred?" Aldrich was momentarily taken aback, then added, "By St. George, you're right. I forgot it was my intention to hate her. I swear on my soul, Magnus, I hadn't thought about it for 2 weeks." Halla would not let that go. which leads me to believe that you've been thinking intently about something else." Aldrich fell silent, watching Edvarda approach as the bondmaid delivered her summons. "If it pleases you, my lord Aldrich, my mistress desires to speak with you immediately." Magnus laughed, pretending to unkempt his hair. "Hail to the prophet! As I follow the girl, a thought crosses my mind. May I be a false prophet in my fortune-telling? I don't wish to tell her the truth. I am afraid that she might scratch my eyes out. As I approach her, she is sitting on a small stool with her hands folded in her lap. Her beautiful face was a glimpse of surprise, having heard unsettling news. However, she gets to the point and asks about Gilly and Birgitte of Trondheim being her parents. I took a deep breath as I plunge into deep waters. I am not a good judge, and there's much to say on the subject. Birgitte is gentle and beautiful, easy to believe she's her mother. But Hedwig shows a tone of disdain, deeming Birgitte a coward for leaving her on the orders of a man. She was tossed out of the castle for wolves or beggars. As for Gilly, Hedwig wants to know more. I stir in my seat, feeling out of place in my outfit. The wardrobe left me no room for simplicity. Everything is adorned with silver and steel bossed. I begin to describe Gilly, but I am not sure what to say. "My lady," he stuttered, "as I have said, I may not be a fair assessor. Gilly was not favourable to me, albeit I have heard he treats his wife very well. He may even offer you lavish gifts." Hedwig's foot stamped on the deck. "I have no interest in that," she declared. He understood her apathy and abandoned any further attempts at diplomacy, but her next words gave him respite. "What message did you pen to my mother for Tove?" "I believe I can recall the precise wording," he responded quickly. It troubled me considerably to spell it out. It read thusly, following the salutation: "Do you recall the child you sent to Eric? She is now in Norway with me. She has grown and is fair. I depart 2 days hence. It would cause her great anguish if she were forced to depart as well. If her father saw her, surely he would take her in. It would even be worth travelling to Greenland for her. Gilly certainly would, if he had the chance to see her." "I think that was the entirety, my lady. If Gilly is as I suspect, it is more than sufficient," Hedwig murmured slowly. She lifted her head and bore into his eyes. "Tell me this plainly, you know and must say. Is he a noble warrior like Tove, or a money-seeking merchant?" "My lady," Aldrich said frantically, "if I am to speak truthfully, Gilly is a petty peasant who regards property as the only matter of importance." Hedwig exhaled audibly, and her lithe fingers clenched in her lap. "Now I know what I feared is true. Answer this honestly, too. If I return to him, is it not probable that he will marry me off to the first suitable bidder?" "Yes," Aldrich confessed. For days he had watched her with commiseration, imagining her in the clutches of the unprincipled merchant. Even though he knew he was innocent, he felt uncomfortable knowing he was the instrument that had brought her trouble. The blood drained from Hedwig's face, drop by drop, and the light faded from her eyes like dying sparks. She slumped, staring ahead like a trapped animal. It was too much for Aldrich. He couldn't bear it any longer. He shook her arm and spoke out. "Lady, don't give in to despair. Get angry at me if you must, though I never meant to harm you. But it's normal to feel resentful towards me. But she ignored him, and he continued, remorseful. He tried to think of something to comfort her. "At least it won't happen for another year, lady, But suddenly she raised her head. "Why not for a year?" she demanded. "Because Gilly is away on a trading voyage. He won't be back until fall, and by then it will be too late to travel to Greenland. He won't come back in the spring and risk losing his best trading season. It's guaranteed to be over a year." Hope crept back into Hedwig's eyes, and Aldrich was relieved. A year is a long time. Many things can happen in a year. Gilly could be killed. Every man has a vulnerable spot, you know. Or I could marry someone in Greenland. 2 chiefs have already asked for my hand, so I won't lack opportunities. "That's true," Aldrich agreed. "Also, Lady Birgitte might never receive my runes. She was away when Valgar left them at her farm. Even if she does receive them, she might not be brave enough to tell the news to Gilly, or he might not want to spend money on a daughter. Where there are so many variables, there are plenty of chances that the danger won't come to pass." Hedwig raised her head boldly. "I shall follow your advice in this matter. I will not burden myself any longer, and I will love Brattahlid as a bird loves the cliff that shelters it. What if Haraldsson is grumpy? Is it not better to be brave and true like her than to be gentle like Lady Birgitte? Would Eric be so foolish as to demand a child's abandonment of her? I'm sure it would turn every hair of his beard red." Aldrich hesitated before stammering, "Yes, and because I like to remember that you have English blood in your veins." Hedwig paused amidst all her excitement and softened her features. With frank good intentions in her starry eyes, she looked at him and spoke softly. "Since there is English blood in me, it might be that you would some day seek the friendship I have offered you." At that moment, it seemed to Aldrich that those kind of candour and sincerity were worth more than all the elegance of his own countrywomen. He extended his hand. "You need not wait long for me to ask for your friendship," he said. "I would have asked it weeks ago, but I did not consider it honourable to call myself your friend when I had done you wrong." Hedwig's slender fingers gave his a determined squeeze with a light-hearted laugh. "That is where you are mistaken. Had you not wronged me, you would have never forgotten that I had wronged you. Now we stand even and begin afresh. That is a good thing." Chapter 12, Through Bars of Ice. In Havamal it is written that a day should be praised at night, a sword when it is tried, and ice when it is crossed. Aldrich stands alongside Hedwig in the bow, admiring the snowy islands in the distance. These summits are the final lands on this side of the world. Aldrich wonders what lies beyond them, perhaps a wall of ice or the end of the earth. Hedwig is not entirely sure, but she does know that there is another land even further west. It is a land she and Magnus used to dream of running away to. They recall their plans and past adventures with great joy. Aldrich's curiosity has been piqued, and he is eager to learn more. "I must implore of you," his words poured forth as soon as he could capture their attention, "to enlighten me with regards to this elusive land. Does it truly exist, or is it but a fanciful tale intended to amuse the young?" Their assurance was resolute. It was indeed a veritable land. "I myself have crossed paths with one of the mariners who laid eyes upon it," Magnus elucidated. "The steersman of Bjorn, no less. He bears witness that the land was visible in clear detail, resplendent with abundant trees." If this land was genuine and not a ploy of witchcraft, why did the sailor not dock and investigate? Questioned Aldrich, perplexed. "Bjorn Herjulfsson is a coward," Hedwig insulted contemptuously. "Every single person who flaps their jaw knows it." Magnus shot her a scornful glance. "You pass judgment with little hesitation. Many attest that he is valiant. Yet he was not exploring. He was voyaging from Iceland to Greenland on a familial visit and strayed from the route. Besides, he wasn't one to eagerly embark on any novel expeditions. Furthermore, it's plausible that he believed the land to be inhabited by dwarves." "There, you admit I am correct," Hedwig rejoiced. "He was petrified of the dwarves, and any man who shrinks from anything is a feeble coward." Magnus artfully parried her attack. "And what of a shield maiden frightened of her own kin?" They jested back and forth, laughing. Unmindful of their banter, Aldrich stared out towards the enigmatic western horizon. His eyes pulsated with profound musings. If he possessed a vessel and a crew, imagine the discoveries he could make. Imagine the potential that lay in kingdoms yet to be constructed. But gradually his grandiose reveries became nebulous, as ethereal as the clouds adrift, and eventually he lost interest. He shifted his gaze to the approaching shore, where they could now distinguish the distinct profile of Greenland, the conglomeration of scattered islets now forming a serrated coastline, a fragmented line of dazzling whiteness, only disrupted by deep crevices blemishing the slopes. Yet beholding Greenland and setting foot upon it were two diverse affairs, he discovered. A bit further they encountered the edge of the pack ice, which travels down from the northeast, accompanied by various majestic icebergs, sealing the mouths of the fjord in the summertime with supernatural efficacy. Valgar expressed calmly, "I would consider it a great stroke of fortune if we were able to traverse through this in a month." "A month!" Aldrich exclaimed, having overheard Valgar's comment. Valgar shot him a look of disdain. "Does a month seem like a long time to you? When Eric travelled here from Iceland, he had to remain stuck in the ice for 4 months. Spending 4 months on a ship, surrounded only by bleak cliffs and an ocean strewn with slippery ice cakes. Aldrich was extremely worried, as evidenced by the distress written all over his face. Magnus was amused, but also felt a tinge of pity for the young man. "It won't be as bad as all that, and we will veer to the north of the fjord and anchor there, protected by an island," Magnus suggested. "Protected?" the English youngster snorted. "Even 12 eider-down beds won't do a thing against this wind." And when they finally reached the island, it wasn't much of a sight to behold either. What wasn't made up of barren rocks was blanketed in black lichens, with moss peeking through some little crevices. The frigid gale, accompanied by dense mist and nippy fog, only served to make things worse. They were marooned in this inhospitable environment for 2 weeks, each Norse week consisting of only 5 days but seemingly eternal to the prisoners from the south. Edvarda took refuge for good in a mammoth sleeping bag made of bearskin that covered her entirely, the only cure for her chattering teeth. Aldrich, on the other hand, donned all the clothing he possessed, and as much of Magnus's as was feasible, and attempted to bear their lot with the same fortitude as his fellow captives. But once in a while, his revulsion towards their predicament would overcome his philosophy. How can intelligent beings possibly force themselves to return to this place once God has allowed them to escape it even once? It is beyond my comprehension, he rumbled on day 10 of this pitiful sojourn. Initially I was petrified that a vessel as tiny as ours would plummet into such a massive sea. Now my only dread is that it will remain afloat and will be placed upon that land, required to live there. Halla regarded him cheerily. If only your lips were as blue as your eyes, and your nose as red as your cheeks, you would be perceived as a handsome man, he added, trying to be supportive. Once more it was Magnus who took pity on Aldrich. Endure it well, for it shall soon conclude, he said. A path has already been created, and within the fjord much is different from what is expected. Aldrich smiled with courteous disbelief. The next day's sun revealed a dark channel open before them, so that by midday they had reached the wide waterway called Eric's Fjord. The stillness between the towering walls was so complete, so deathly, as to border on the eerie. Mile after mile they traversed between stark cliffs crowned with ice and clothed in black lichen, and mile after mile further still, without passing anything more cheerful than a group of rocky islets or a slope covered with brownish moss. The most luxurious of the islets could only boast of a patch of crowberry bushes or a few creeping junipers, too timid to rise a finger's length above the earth. Aldrich surveyed his surroundings with a sigh, and then gazed at Magnus with a pained expression. "Do you still assert that this is more agreeable than drowning?" he questioned. Magnus met the comment with obstinate composure. "Are you blind to the verdancy of that plain over there? And do you not feel the sun's warmth upon you?" All of a sudden it dawned on Aldrich that the biting wind from the headlands had ceased its blowing. The fog had vanished, and there was a pleasant warmth in the air around him. And over there, certainly that meadow was as green as the one back home. He shed one of his cloaks and settled himself to observe. Gradually the green patches became more frequent until there was nothing else in sight. In one spot he nearly thought he saw a glint of golden buttercups. The foliage crept up the snow-covered slopes, hundreds and thousands of feet, and at some points, in proximity to some rushing little waterfall tumbling down from a glacier-fed rivulet, a rhododendron shone like a rosy blaze. They passed the last islet, blanketed with a thicket of willows as tall as a grown man's head, and entered an expansive stretch of water flanked by rolling grasslands filled with daisies and docile cattle. Magnus grabbed the English lad's arm in excitement. "Yonder are Eric's shipyards, and over the hill there where the smoke rises, there's Bretalid." "There!" Aldrich exclaimed. "But I seem to recall you telling me that Eric's house sits on Eric's Fjord." "It seems we have arrived, though the exact distance is inconsequential, mere semantics. The location rests on the edge of Einar's Fjord, a seldom-travelled path by locals who prefer the settlement's other areas. One may only spot it when they venture out to sea. Wait, is that a human standing on the pier? If the crowd has not already noticed us and come to greet us, then their vision has declined since we last visited 3 years ago," remarked Halla before Magnus prophesied. "They are there. Can you not see them? Multiple groups scattered near the sheds, with someone signalling us with a cloak. By the grace of St. Michael, the view of Normandy did not bring me as much joy as this sight. Lower the sails, drop anchor, and prepare to disembark," commanded Valgar in his monotonous tone. Chapter 13. Vidar the Black in his domain. "Hail, givers! A guest is among us. Where shall he sit? Water is needed by those who come for refreshment, along with towels, a hospitable invitation, and a warm welcome. If possible, discourse and answers should also be offered. This is the way of Havamal." The ship's boat brought them to land in groups of 10, each greeted by a crowd of armed retainers, house servants, field hands, and thralls. The arrival of Hedwig was met with a roar of delight, and Magnus was nearly overwhelmed by welcoming hands. While the crowd stood in awe of Tove, they made way for him respectfully, and a pack of dogs almost tore him to pieces in their joyful frenzy. Shoulders were patted repeatedly, and buxom maids embraced brawny necks while receiving hearty smacks in return. Aldrich, with his short hair and rich dress, was stared at curiously. Men whispered that Tove had become so grand that he needed a page to carry his cloak like the king himself, while women thought he looked handsome in black, and the colour suited his fair complexion. Kark scowled as he disembarked and heard their comments. "Where is my father, Thrall?" demanded Kark, with a haughtiness far greater than that of the chief. "He has gone hunting with Thorwald Eriksson," answered one of the house thralls. "He won't be back until tonight." Kark's colourless face turned red with anger, and he rudely pushed through the throng, disappearing among the ship sheds. "Is my brother Thorstein also in Greenland?" Tove asked the servant. The man replied that Eric's youngest son was absent on a visit to his mother's relatives in Iceland. When the boat had brought the last man to land, the sea deer was left to float until it was time for unloading, and they began to move up from the shore in a boisterous procession. A broad path winded through lush meadows and miniature forests of willow and birch and alder. Amidst the clamour of voices and laughter, they strolled along the path, the party jostling and playing, arms locking around waists and jostling bundles of loot. They trekked on for nearly 2 miles until the path led some 400 feet away from the rocky banks of Einar's fjord and terminated at the gates of a high fence. Had the fortress gates been shut, one could have accurately surmised what lay behind them, so uniformly planned were Norse manors. A massive quadrangular courtyard, surrounded by sturdy buildings, dominated the complex. On the right were the elaborate kitchens and stores of the great hall. The women's house stood on the far side, with the herb garden on one end and guest chambers on the other. To the left there were stables, pigsties, sheep pens, cowsheds, and smithies. A second wave of affectionate greetings erupted as soon as they went inside the entrance gates. In the grassy surroundings, more armed soldiers, white-clad thralls, yapping dogs, servants dressed in their best, and, at their head, the renowned Eric the Red and his determined Haraldsson were gathered. Just one glance at the Red One was enough to persuade Aldrich that he was everything he was said to be. It wasn't only his flowing hair and long beard that were fiery, but his entire being appeared to be capable of instant combustion. A single spark could ignite his choleric blue eyes, now sparkling with good humour, into a raging fire, while a puff of wind could fan the ruddy patches on his cheeks into infernos. As Aldrich observed him, he thought, "It isn't his exile 3 times because of murder that astounds me. It's that he wasn't exiled 30 times. Aldrich peered at the chubby woman, wearing a dignified white linen headdress studded with jingling keys, and was taken aback by her unexpected appearance. Her unyielding mouth had no traces of softness, and her eyes, like Tove's, were staunch. Nevertheless, it wasn't an evil or nagging countenance. The beauty of truth and strength radiated from her broad, smooth brow and unfaded cheeks. As her eyes fell upon Tove, they softened with motherly love and pride, her hands eager to embrace him. After the proper decorum of embracing his parents, the tumult erupted. Voices blended together in a chaotic symphony, each man unable to hear his neighbour. Taking advantage of the confusion, Aldrich approached Hedwig. With no greetings of his own, he played matchmaker. Hedwig stood with Edvarda, her eyes fixed on Haraldsson, nervously fidgeting. Aldrich whispered in her ear, "She will make you a better mother than Birgitte of Trondheim. It is my advice that you reconcile with her at once." Hedwig contemplated Aldrich's words. "It was in my mind that I could love her." Shrugging off Edvarda, Hedwig took a hesitant step forward. Haraldsson parted from Tove and turned towards Magnus. Hedwig took another step forward, her resolve strengthening. As Haraldsson looked upon Hedwig's picturesque figure, dressed in a short kirtle and shirt of steel, she stiffened with a fierce frown. But Hedwig was undeterred, quickly embracing Haraldsson, laying her head upon her breast and holding tight. In time, the matron slipped her arms around Hedwig's waist and shoulders, kissing her forehead before giving her a once-over. "You have grown like a leek. I'm surprised such a life hasn't ruined your complexion. Was cloth so scarce in Norway that Tove couldn't afford a proper skirt? You'll wear one of mine the moment we're indoors. It's time you had a proper woman to look after you." Hedwig, no longer repelled by Haraldsson's severity, appreciated the kindness within. With proper submissiveness, she bowed her head and said, "Yes, kinswoman." Catching Aldrich's eye, she laughed. Eric's voice boomed above the noise. "You fools! Do not let them starve outside. Bring them inside and feast. Drink to the lucky one with the finest mead in all of Greenland. Come in, and be greeted in the name of the troll." Halla cast a sly grin to Einar. "There is no telling what he may say in the name of the troll once he learns why the lucky one is here," he whispered. Chapter 14. For the Sake of the Cross. A wise guest knows to stay quiet at dinner, listening and observing with both ears and eyes. This is the way of all prudent men. In step with the current fashion, Brattahlid was a hall not simply in the sense of a large room, but a structure all its own. It was also a building with a truly unique appearance. Instead of the customary huge logs usually found in Norse residences, the hall had 3 walls constructed of massive blocks of red sandstone. The fourth side was a low, perpendicular, smooth rock, so that one of the inner walls was formed by a natural cliff between 10 and 12 feet high. It was from this distinctiveness that the name Bratalid was given, as it meant steep side of a rock. With its simplicity and humble square opening in the roof instead of a chimney, and little windows composed of bladder-like membranes rather than glass, the hall was nonetheless impressive. It was large enough for nearly 200 men to sit on the 2 benches running from end to end. The walls were so symmetrically and massively built as to outlast the wear of time, and the interior had even a certain splendor. Tonight, decked out for a feast, it was magnificent to behold. Tapestries of many hues lined the walls, where rows of round shields overlapped each other like brightly painted scales. Embroidered cloths were laid over the benches, while the floor was strewn with straw that sparkled like spun gold. On either side of the long stone hearth that ran through the center of the hall, tables were set with flax covers as white as foam. The light of the crackling pine torches danced and shimmered, reflecting off of gilded vessels, silver-covered trenchers, and goblets of rare and beautiful glass in shades of ruby, amber, and emerald green. "I have not seen a finer hall," Aldrich remarked to Magnus as they made their way through the crowd. If the high seats were rearranged, the fireplace was against the wall, and there were reeds on the floor instead of straw, it might have been similar to my father's castle. If I were entirely different, Aldrich wondered aloud, would I resemble a Saxon maiden as well? Hedwig chuckled in his ear. She had just entered through the women's entrance, accompanied by a group of aristocratic women and Haraldsson. Already she had undergone a transformation. Her trailing blue dress gave her the illusion of standing a head taller. The gold belt around her waist, the gold brooch on her chest, and the string of amber beads around her fair neck dispelled all traces of the shield maiden. For the first time, Aldrich realized that she was more than just a close friend. She was a girl, an exquisite girl whom a man would adore and pursue. He watched her with astonishment, admiration, and something else, studying her so intently that he did not notice Einar's eyes on him. Hedwig laughed at his astonishment before shifting to a frown. "I will be furious with you if you say that you prefer me in these clothes," she grumbled under her breath. Fortunately, Aldrich did not have to state his preferences. At that moment, the head woman, who also served as the mistress of ceremonies when the steward was away, hurried through the throng and separated the men from the ladies, indicating their assigned spots in the hall based on the strictest interpretation of the laws of order. If there had been more time to prepare, there would have been a larger group to welcome the returning guardsmen. Yet the messengers dispatched by Haraldsson had returned with nearly 20 chieftains and their families, along with their myriad supporters, and Eric's household. The walls had scarcely any empty seats because Tov's followers plus Eric's household supplemented the attendees. Eric sat on his high seat, held up by 2 lofty carved pillars in the hall's midpoint along the northern stretch. Haraldsson sat with him, while the clansmen sat on his right, and noblewomen on his left, arranged in strict order of precedence. As was customary, Tov sat opposite Eric in the other high seat, as the guest of honor and the eldest son of his father. Ironbeard dozed next to Tov, bundled up in fur, while Jarl Harald's boy sat on the other side, looking cheerful, fresh-faced, and dressed like a prince. On both sides, akin to pearls adorning a choker, the crew of the sea-deer were strung. Kark was situated in the final spot in line, occupying the seat nearest the door. Aldrich was exceedingly grateful for the hand of fate that had altered their positions. His current role was to sit on the footstool at Tov's high seat, keeping watch over the chieftain's cup. It was a respectable position, one that bestowed upon him the ability to see and hear the occurrences of the feast, sometimes even conversing with Magnus when anything significant transpired that he couldn't keep to himself. The men who served under Tov were experiencing numerous temptations to join forces. Every one of them waited in anticipation to learn of the purpose behind the guardsman's presence. They'd received direct orders from Tov to not take any action without his consent. They'd also been given explicit instruction from Valgar to protect their leader under all circumstances. Caught in the crossfire, they remained vigilant, even while dining pleasurably. After the towels and hand basins made their way around the table and all of the food had been distributed, 3 musicians appeared carrying fiddles and a harp. Their performance served as a distraction, enabling the visitors to relax their minds. "Have you noticed he has concealed his crucifix under his cloak where it's less likely to be seen?" one whispered to the other. "I believe it's because he wants to stall for as long as possible. When he's presented with the horse meat, he'll have no choice but to refuse, exposing himself," the other replied. However, Eric didn't see Tove shake his head when the illegal meat was offered. The danger passed. Halla whispered in Magnus's ear, "It's sensible to remain concealed as long as you can. It's important to gain a decent foothold before the hurricane hits you." Magnus rolled his head. "When you're trying to disarm a viper, it's more prudent to agitate them into attacking, extricating the poison from their fangs." Under the guise of some twanging chords being played, Aldrich whispered to them, "If you could observe Kark's visage from here, you'd liken it to that of a dog anticipating an attack. He continues to stare at the door. What is it that he's expecting to emerge?" Neither could speculate. They each started to keep watch over the entrance. Meanwhile, merriment abounded as a feast of extravagant proportions ruled the hall. The table was adorned with the most succulent of dishes: reindeer tongues, fish, broiled veal, horse steaks, roast birds, shining white pork. Not to mention, wine was poured by the jugful, along with vats of beer and casks of mead. Curds sat side by side with loaves of rye bread, and mounds of butter, and mountains of cheese. Toasts and compliments were thrown about as if they were coins that held no value. Aldrich was kept on his toes as he rapidly filled his master's goblet, as so many wished to share in the pleasure of drinking with him. His tales of Norway were listened to with bated breath, and his pronouncements were received with deference. Often it seemed as though the mere sound of his voice could make things happen. The young Englishman, though, couldn't help but notice that Tove said nothing of their newfound faith. With the festivities still in full swing, one of the fiddlers began to sing a ballad that Magnus in particular recognized. It was the song of the dwarf-cursed sword. The moment the tune reached his ears, Magnus choked on his curd, and even Valga gave Tove a side glance. However, Tove sat there stone-faced, and his followers were the only ones to notice that he did not join in the enthusiastic applause that followed. A few of the crew members showed signs of impatience. They were used to fighting, which was second only to drinking when it came to their pleasures. The diplomatic wait was almost too much for them. Fortunately, at this point, some trick dogs were brought in to entertain the guests. Watching their playful antics, everyone forgot their impatience and revelled in the boisterous delight. While they cheered the dog that had jumped the highest over his pole and banged their fists on the table to express their approval, they heard the sound of voices and horses whinnying outside. "It is Thorwald, back from his hunt!" exclaimed Magnus eagerly as he turned toward the door. He was proven right when the door opened, revealing the exhausted hunter and his companion. Thorwald Eriksson couldn't have been more different from his brother Tove. He was long, lanky, and muscular, with thin lips etched in cruel lines. His attire was shabby, torn in some places, and soiled with mud and blood on his tunic and hands. He stood, surprised by the lively gathering before him, squinting as he adjusted to the sudden brightness. Then his eyes met Tove's, and he cried out with delight, hurrying to clasp his hand. But as Aldrich recoiled from the reek of his foul garments, he glimpsed Kark holding Thorwald's companion, whispering urgently in his ear. The newly arrived man was hardly amiable, with a hulking form and a scowl that revealed his capacity for wickedness. As Kark spoke, his features contorted with fury, and he harshly gripped his knife hilt. It dawned on Aldrich that this was Thorhall, Kark's father and the steward whom Valga had mentioned. "Something is about to happen," Aldrich mused, attempting to signal Magnus, but Thorwald stood between them, still clasping Tove's hand. After the hunter had passed by, Thorhall approached Tove and greeted him politely. Only then did he seem to notice Aldrich's presence, stopping abruptly in surprise. "What's this, chief? Have you replaced my son, whom your father gave you, with another bowerman? Kark must have done something to displease you. Tell me what it is, and I will kill him myself," Thorhall offered. Valgar gave Aldrich a sidelong glance, as if to say he had warned him about the steward. Ironbeard trembled as he fiddled with his beard, casting furtive glances at Eric, catching the Red One's attention. His palm cupped his ear to catch every word, and his eyes remained fixed on Tove. The guardsman's face was inscrutable, much like his goblet. If Kark truly deserved death, he would no longer be alive. "Nevertheless, I exchanged him for a more capable man," he replied. Thorhall bowed his head in apparent submission. "As always, your judgment is sound. Better to have a man of ability, even if he is an impious Christian, than an uncouth Odin man? With that, he turned away, entirely unaware of the sting in his words. A murmur travelled down the line of Tov's men, audible enough to catch attention, suggesting that Thrall set a trap to avenge his son's insult. Everyone pondered if the chief would allow this to pass as well. Although everyone had their faces set forward, their eyes were keenly tracking him. Tov raised his head proudly and spoke quietly. "It is not wise to address me with such words. Also, I too am a Christian." It was like flint striking steel. Eric stormed up from his chair. "Say that again!" Thorwald and a dozen guests frantically shook their heads at Eric, but Tov repeated his previous statement. Crash! Eric slammed his goblet on the table, the glass shattering into a million pieces. With a curse, he threw himself back into the chair, panting and glaring. A hum filled the room with a maddening sound. Men offered soothing words to the Red One and admonished Tov. Some of the women turned a ghastly shade and banded together. Hedwig left her place with a shining face and sat on Tov's stool, even though Haraldsson's voice grew louder in scolding. Tov's men bolted to an alert stance, looking at their master with expectancy, like trained dogs. Thorwald rushed to his brother, put his hands on his shoulders, and attempted to reason with him. Tov brushed him aside, stood up, and confronted his father. Amidst the turmoil, Tov's voice rang out, calm and steadfast, perfectly composed, belonging to a fearless heart with an iron will. "It pains me that you dislike what I have done," he said calmly. "However, I believe it is best to tell you the truth, so that you would not feel betrayed. Olaf Tryggvason converted me to Christianity 2 winters ago, and I could tell you that he was the greatest help I've ever had. Not only am I a Christian, but everyone who serves me is also a Christian. They would rather have their backs cut with blood eagles than renounce their faith." Eric's mouth hung agape, his face contorting with rage as he hoisted the unsightly bronze battle-axe that rested at his side. His fingers traced its curves, tossing it between his hands with unbridled anger. The eyes of the entire room followed the sharp implement, fearing its next move. "If Eric does not wish to harm his own kin, perhaps he'll find solace in attacking me," muttered Aldrich, hypnotized by the weapon's sway. "If he brings it down again, I shall dodge," he added, stirring unrest among Tov's followers. Tov, however, remained calm. "Your gods have met their demise. Know that it's time to accept a new deity, one willing to aid you," he said, urging them to embrace Olaf's faith. As Hedwig scurried for safety, Eric's arm darted upwards and back, releasing a howl of fury as he flung the axe at his son. Valgar swore, and the crew bellowed, but the axe missed by a hair's breadth, lodging itself into the wall. Immediately everyone rose to their feet, with swords drawn and voices raised. Tov alone remained steadfast and ordered his followers to stand down. With remarkable composure, Tove spoke to his father, demonstrating the decorum that separates a human from a brute. "It is a curious thing," mused Tove, "that the one who taught me the laws of hospitality should be the one to break them with me." With a certain resignation in his voice, he continued, "Nonetheless, now that I have laid bare the purpose of my visit, I shall not vex you further. Since you have declined to offer us lodging, my men and I will return to my vessel to rest until my task has been achieved. Valgar, you will go first." Valgar hesitated, his mind racing with concern. "My liege," he protested, "this is a grave peril. The heathens will have your life." "You will obey my order," Tov replied in a tone that could not be disobeyed, his resolve unyielding. The men obeyed, filing out without further word or weapons. As they strode through the chamber, a sense of awe and fear descended upon Eric's warriors and companions. Even Aldrich, who had stayed behind to watch his back, eventually had to make his exit. With a hint of hesitation, Hedwig strode out alongside Aldrich, her eyes flashing like daggers, her cheeks scarlet. Haraldsson called out to her, but her mind was set. She would not be deterred. Aldrich looked back, unwilling to depart without one last glimpse. Tov still stood in front of Eric's throne, eyes fixed upon his rival with a steely calmness. Aldrich could not help but feel the urge to reaffirm his loyalty to his chief. At last, the procession wound its way to the exit, Tov standing proudly at the helm. As he walked out alone between the ranks of his enemies, a murmuring of respect rose from the assembled onlookers. Even Haraldsson, Eric's mother, was moved by the display. Huddled close, she whispered in Eric's ear. His face turned a deep shade of fury, his fists slamming against the table with a thunderous roar. Such a sight had never been witnessed before. Whether friend or foe, none could deny the gravity of the situation. Cease! When did I utter a disdainful word towards your lodging? Do you seek to disgrace my benevolence before my guests? Your faith is unwanted, loathsome. You shall no longer be my offspring. I disinherit you. Yet you shall reside in my abode and devour at my table while you are within Greenland, including your entourage. No man shall dare assail the kindness of Eric of Brattahlid. Thrall, escort them to their quarters. Gasping for air, Eric concluded with a fierce motion before reclining back in his seat. Had Tove acted on his pride, perhaps, Greenland would have bidden him farewell that very night. Nevertheless, Tove's top priority was the accomplishment of his goal before his self-importance. After a brief hesitation, he politely accepted Eric's proposition and conceded to Thrall's obsequious service. One can envision the astonishment of Tove's companions when they beheld him emerge from the manor, intact and attended by the steward and a dozen torch-bearers. "It is due to his divine favour," they murmured to one another. "His deity aids him in every venture. It is a creed worth living and dying for." They raided across the grassy courtyard to the base of the staircase leading to Tove's lodgings, and would not depart until Valgar and Olver were permitted to act as his bodyguards. "Also this lad," Tove said, gesturing to Aldrich. As Aldrich approached, Kark insolently thrust himself forward. "Leader, am I to be ousted and left to slumber with the swine in the kitchen?" he audaciously proclaimed. "Remember, every occasion you lodged here, I was safeguarding your threshold." Tove's gaze penetrated him through and through. Is it reasonable to entrust one's slumber to a canine that once savaged him? Go slumber in the kennel. You would hardly have to wait for long if it weren't for infuriating Eric to feel my blade. Turning, he strode up the stairway, his hand on Aldrich's shoulder. Chapter 15. A Wolf Pack in Leash. He who speaks too much, and never pauses to listen, will inevitably bring harm upon himself. As Havamal wisely suggests, a garrulous tongue can lead to one's own demise. Outside, in the shelter of the Grand Hall, the 4 youthful members of Tove's train took a respite from their lively game of ball. They had been ashore for 4 weeks now since returning from the Sea Deer. Despite the August sunshine, an unmistakable chill had set in as summer began to fade. Magnus wrapped his cloak tightly around himself, shivering. "Brr, this place is unbearable," he exclaimed. Halla, who leaned casually against the doorway, whittled a block of wood as he hummed a tune. "Hewed we with the hanger? It happed that when I young was east in Aria's channel, outpoured we blood for grim wolves." He finished with a smile and looked down at the others. "You're fussing too much about this doorstep. We will be leaving it shortly. Can't you hear them approaching?" He nodded towards the gateway from which the faint sound of hunting horns could be heard. "It's Eric's men coming back from their hunting, and they'll be upon us in a matter of moments. We should move elsewhere." With a lazy stretch, he flicked the wood chips from his pants and stood straight. However, the other 3 remained motionless. "I don't see why we have to avoid conflict," Aldrich grumbled. "We can remain here without speaking, and give them ample room to pass through into the hall. What trouble can we get into?" Halla smiled graciously at the disgruntled trio. "If that's what you believe, then I fear you're no better than friends with Anne the Simpleton. Can you not see that they would take pleasure in bumping into one of us? If they have been successful in their hunt, their blood will be boiling, while if they have failed, they will be seething with anger. And as we all know, it doesn't take much to start a violent fight. Olver's death serves as a reminder for us all." Aldrich winced, and Magnus shivered with something besides the cold. It was not the bloody tumult of the fight that they remembered the most clearly. It was what came after it. True to his interpretation of hospitality, Eric had punished the murder of his guest's servant by lopping off, with his own sword, the right hand of the murderer, whereupon Tove had sworn to meet the same justice to any man of his who should slay a follower of Eric. Slowly, as the blaring horns and trampling hooves drew nearer, the 3 rose to their feet. Only Aldrich struck the ground a savage blow with the bat he still held. "By St. George, it is unbearable that we should be forced to act in such a foolish way. Has Tove less spirit than a wood-goat? I do not see what he means by it," Aldrich exclaimed. "Nor I," echoed Magnus. "Nor I," growled Einar. "I believed he had some of Eric's temper in him. I do not see why myself," Haller admitted, "but I see something that seems to me of greater importance, and that is how he looked when he gave the order." They followed him across the grassy enclosure, though they still grumbled. "Where shall we go? The stable also is full of Eric's men. Before long we shall be shoved off the land altogether. We will have to swim over to Bjorn's dwarf country." "I propose that we go to the landing place," exclaimed Magnus. It may be that the ship which Valgar sighted this morning is nearly here. I say nothing against that, Haller assented. They wheeled promptly toward a gate, but at that moment Aldrich caught sight of a blue-gowned figure watering linen in front of the women's house. "Do you go on without me?" he said, drawing back. "I will follow in a moment." Magnus threw him a keen glance. "Is it your intention to do anything exciting, like quarrelling with Thrall as you did last night? Let me stay and share it." There was a little embarrassment in Aldrich's laugh. "No such intention have I. I wish to see the hunters ride in." The hunters appeared grand as they entered the court, cheers ringing through the doors. White-robed servants catered to their horses, unsaddling them while the crimson-cloaked sportsmen emptied their game bags onto the grass. Horns blared and hounds struggled in their leash. Aldrich, however, paid no mind to any of it, too eager to reach Hedwig, Gilly's daughter, who walked between strips of linen, sprinkling them with water from a bronze pan using a little broom of twigs. Her face was more angular, the roses on her cheeks fainter, yet her welcoming smile remained just as beautiful. "I was hoping someone would finally come over here. It's such a relief to talk to a man again. I've grown so tired of women and their constant chatter about brewing and spinning. Yesterday, Freydis, Eric's daughter, came by and talked of nothing but—" "Eric's daughter?" Aldrich repeated, surprised. "I've never heard of Tove having a sister. Why was she never mentioned? Where does she reside?" Hedwig impatiently shrugged her shoulders. "She lives in Gardar with a foolish man named Thorvard, whom she married for his wealth. She's a despicable person. No one speaks of her because they fear Haraldsson's retaliation. There is immense hatred between them. They quarrelled before Freydis could even stay long. To be honest, I'm glad it happened. All she talked about were her expensive possessions. Oh, how I wish Odin never created women. It would have been better if they were elm trees." Aldrich regarded her warmly. "It would be a misfortune if you were an elm tree, though it's likely we'd converse as much as we do now. I rarely see you except during meals, but I've never passed by your window without thinking about how much I pity your misfortune." "I thank you," replied Hedwig, her friendly grin on her face. "But where have the other men gone? I want to speak with Magnus." "They've gone to the landing spot to see a ship that Valgar spotted this morning from the rocks," he responded. Hedwig's joyous cry followed. "A ship in Einar's fjord. Then it must belong to a chief of the settlement who is returning from a Viking voyage. There will be a grand feast held in their honor." Aldrich followed her down the lane, skeptically, walking by the white patches. "Do you really think it will benefit us? It's possible that Tove won't be invited." Her scornful tone matched the fiery heat of the sun. "You're acting insane. Do you think men who trade among the Christians are as small-minded as Eric? Tove is recognized as a man of distinction and a friend of Olaf Tryggvason. They will be delighted to sit at the table with him." "He might not want to dine with heathens," Aldrich speculated. "That's a possibility," Hedwig conceded. She emptied her pan and, with a sigh, said, "How dreary everything is, sitting at a table where you're afraid to move for fear of a fight. I speak truthfully when I say that this is the most enjoyable thing I do all day, standing here, sprinkling clothes and observing who comes and goes. And now that my pan is empty, I must go back inside. Valgar is beckoning you over yonder." Aldrich probably wouldn't have moved swiftly to comply, but with a nod and smile, Hedwig turned and headed in the other direction, leaving no other alternatives. Aldrich trudged ahead to meet the steersman. The old warrior regarded the young favourite apathetically. "Tove wants you to attend to him now." "Is he in his sleeping quarters?" Aldrich asked. "Yes," Valgar answered. Aldrich was taken aback by this sudden summons. He usually read after Tove had retired for the night. Had the chief overheard his argument with Thorhall? He hesitated, considering a question, but after another glance at Valgar's battered face, decided against it. He turned abruptly and headed towards the storehouse that had become Tove's base of operations. A loft accessible solely via a ladder-like outer staircase, lacking a fireplace, stove, or any means of heating, may not appear pleasant. Yet one would gain greater appreciation when one takes into account the alternative of a bed in the great hall, where the air was as stale as it was warm, and the space was shared with inebriated men, spilled beer, and scraps left over from the feast. Aldrich was not inclined to hold high regard for his master's new lodgings, as England itself offered nothing more comfortable. Once he climbed the lengthy staircase and opened the weighty door, a sense of admiration overcame him. The state guest chamber was not devoid of homely touches. It was sizable, spacious, and weatherproof, and boasted 3 windows. The box-shaped, straw-filled beds, built into the wall, were adorned with snowy linens and eiderdown covers. The lengthy brass-bound chests, located on either side of the door, were piled with furs until they provided the softest and warmest resting places. A myriad of Tove's extravagant dresses hung from a row of nails, covered the exposed walls, and gave a grand tapestry-like appearance. The table was equipped with gracefully designed bronze water pitchers and silver wash-basins, and scattered with silver scissors, gold-mounted combs, and fancifully decorated knives, along with an assortment of costly baubles. Near the table stood an impressively carved armchair. Upon seeing the man leaning against the flaming red cushions of eiderdown, Aldrich ceased his admiration. The leader's eyebrows drew together in a dense line across his nose. The youthful bowerman knew, without words, why he had been summoned. He halted at the door, one step into the room, irritated and uncomfortable. After a while Tove spoke sternly. "You are exceedingly quiet now, but it seems to me that I heard your voice loudly enough in the hall last night. It was merely that I was accusing Thrall of attempting to deceive me. He allowed me to go up to the loft above the provision house without informing me that the floorboards had been removed, so that they could pour the new mead into the vat in the room below. In one more step, I would have plunged through the opening and drowned. It is apparent that he did it to seek revenge for Kark. I would have burst had I not informed him so. I have ordered my men not to engage in conversation with the men of Eric, except on friendly terms, and to avoid quarrels as if they were avoiding death." His tone, with its calm authority, had started to affect his young follower, and Aldrich's head had lowered. But suddenly he looked up with a bold gleam in his eye. "Then I have not disobeyed you, my lord, because I would not shy away from death if it seemed cowardly to me." At first, Tove's retort brought a sardonic smile to his lips. Then, abruptly, his expression froze into a look of terrible rage. He almost stood up from his chair. "Do you dare tell me to my face that I am a coward because I ordered you to keep the peace?" Aldrich gasped. "My lord, there is no man in the world who would have the nerve to utter such words to you. I only meant that I am unable to bear Thorhall's insults in silence." If someone else had said this, the response would have been prompt and ferocious. However, Tove's behavior toward this member was always distinct from how he dealt with others, either because he respected his abilities, had a fondness for him, or detected a rare refinement in him in that barbaric era. His rage faded from his face, and he spoke calmly. "Can you not bear such a small thing for the sake of spreading your faith?" The lad was taken aback. "Without peace to gain their approval so that they listen to us willingly, our cause is futile. I won't endure as a guest of the man who tried to kill me, who takes a look away from me when I am seated at his table, and lets his servants insult me since I am a coward. Sometimes I feel like it would be easier to bear the martyrdom of the blessed saints." He suddenly moved fiercely in his chair, as if the fire in his veins had struck him and scorched his flesh. Then, for the initial time, Aldrich grasped what he meant. He bowed before him, scolded and humbled. "Dear God, it is with remorse that I acknowledge my wrongdoing. I implore your forgiveness and seek guidance on how to make amends. Place my instructions above your own wants, just as I set King Olaf's desire above my ego, and just as he values God's will above his own." "I pledge to you, my lord, that I shall not falter again." Tove replied with a hint of severity. "Ensure that you keep your word."